I was a criminal. A thief. A dead man walking. And yet, in my final moments, I saw something that changed everything. You don't know my name. No one remembers men like me. We live in the shadows, take what isn't ours, and die forgotten. That was my fate. I wasn't always this way. I had a mother once. A home. A life. But somewhere along the way, I lost my path. I made choices, bad ones. Maybe it was out of desperation. Maybe greed. Maybe just because it was easier to take than to build. But it doesn't matter now. The Romans had no patience for men like me. I was caught, tried, sentenced without a second thought. No appeal. No mercy. My punishment? Crucifixion. A slow death. The worst kind. They dragged me through the streets, forcing me to carry my own cross. My body was already broken, bloodied from the lashes of the Roman whips. Every step was agony. The weight of the wood bit into my torn flesh. But no one cared. People spat at me, cursed me. Some laughed. To them, I wasn't a man. Just another criminal getting what I deserved. And maybe they were right. By the time we reached the hill, I could barely stand. The soldiers didn't care. They threw me onto the wood, stretched my arms wide, and drove thick iron nails through my wrists. I screamed. Pain exploded through my body, unlike anything I had ever felt. My hands shook, my vision blurred. But it wasn't over. They lifted the cross, dropped it into the hole in the ground, and the force tore through my body. Every breath was a battle. My arms burned, my legs trembled. The only way to breathe was to push up on the nails in my feet, just for a moment of air, before the pain forced me to sink back down. This was how I would die. I had accepted that. But then, I saw him. The man beside me. The one they called Jesus. He had been beaten worse than me. His back torn apart, his face bloodied. A crown of thorns pressed deep into his skull. And yet, he was silent. Not cursing, not screaming. Just looking at them. At the ones who had done this to him. And then he spoke. Father, forgive them. For they know not what they do. Forgive them? My mind couldn't make sense of it. The soldiers, the ones who had nailed him to that cross, the ones who mocked him, laughed at his pain, he was praying for them? Who was this man? And why, even in his suffering, did he seem stronger than all of us? The crowd was relentless. They weren't satisfied just watching us die. They wanted more. Mockery. Spite. Entertainment. They pointed at Jesus, laughing, sneering. Even the religious leaders, the ones who were supposed to be holy men, stood there, full of hate. He saved others, but he can't save himself. If you are the Son of God, come down from that cross. Then we'll believe you. Their words dripped with venom. They didn't want proof. They wanted humiliation. They wanted to see him suffer, to break him completely. And the worst part? They weren't the only ones. The man on the other side of Jesus, the other thief, he joined in too. His voice was hoarse, full of bitterness. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself. And us. I turned my head toward him. His face was twisted in pain, but also in rage. Like me, he was a criminal. A man who had spent his life taking. Fighting. Running. And now, at the end of it all, he was still full of hate. I knew that kind of anger. I had lived with it my whole life. When you've lost everything, when the world has beaten you down, when you know that no one will remember you, the easiest thing to do is spit back in its face. Curse the world before it curses you one last time. And yet, something inside me was changing. I looked at Jesus again. He had every right to curse them back. To shout in anger. To tell them who he really was. But he didn't. Instead, he prayed. Father, forgive them. For they know not what they do. Forgive them. I couldn't understand it. The ones who nailed him to that cross. The ones who mocked him, spat at him, beat him until he barely looked human. And he was asking God to forgive them? Who does that? I tried to make sense of it, but I couldn't. I had spent my life taking from people. Hurting people. I had lived by one rule: look out for yourself, because no one else will. I had betrayed, lied, stolen, and worse. And yet, here was this man, innocent by every measure, bruised and bleeding, and showing love to the very people who had done this to him. I had never seen anything like it. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt something stir in me. Regret. Shame. A question I had never dared to ask before. Was there still hope for a man like me? I looked at Jesus again. He didn't look like a king. Not the way kings were supposed to look. No crown of gold, only thorns. No throne, only a cross. No robe, only flesh torn open by whips. And yet, he carried himself like a king. Not like the rulers of this world, desperate for power, taking whatever they could to hold on to it. No. He had a different kind of power. A power that gave instead of took. A power that forgave instead of condemned. And for the first time, I wondered. Could he forgive me, too? Pain. It was all I knew now. It tore through my body, radiating from the nails in my wrists and feet, burning like fire with every breath. My lungs screamed for air, but the only way to get it was to push up against the spike in my feet, just for a moment, before collapsing under the agony. I was dying. But I wasn't alone. On one side of me, another criminal, a man like me, condemned, broken, breathing his last. And on the other side, Jesus. I had heard the name before. Everyone had. Some said he was a prophet. Others, a miracle worker. Some whispered that he was the Messiah. I hadn't cared. Men like me didn't have time for holy men. What did a prophet have to do with a thief? What did a miracle worker have to do with someone like me, someone who had spent his life taking instead of giving, lying instead of telling the truth, running instead of standing? But now, here he was. Bleeding. Dying. Just like me. And yet, nothing like me at all. Because as the crowd jeered, as the soldiers laughed, as the religious leaders mocked him, he said nothing. He didn't curse them. He didn't spit at them. He didn't beg for mercy. Instead, he lifted his head and whispered through cracked lips. Father, forgive them. For they know not what they do. Forgive them? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The men who had torn the flesh from his back. The ones who had nailed him to this cross, laughed at his pain, stripped him bare for all to see. And he was asking God to forgive them? I had never seen anything like it. Even in suffering, even in death, he was nothing like the rest of us. The other thief sneered. Aren't you the Messiah? He spat, his voice thick with bitterness. Save yourself. And us. His words hit me harder than I expected. I turned my head toward him. His face was twisted in pain and rage, eyes wild, teeth clenched. And I saw myself. That was me. That was the man I had been. Angry. Bitter. Blaming everyone but myself. Spitting in the face of truth, even as I stood on the edge of eternity. And suddenly, I couldn't take it anymore. Something inside me broke. The words tumbled from my mouth before I could stop them. Don't you fear God? I gasped, my voice hoarse from the strain. We are punished justly, we deserve this. But this man. He has done nothing wrong. For the first time in my life, I saw things clearly. I was guilty. I had earned this death. Everything I had done, every wrong I had committed, had led me to this moment. And yet, here beside me was a man who didn't deserve this. A man suffering, not for his own sins, but for ours. I had spent my whole life stealing, running, hiding. But I couldn't run anymore. All I could do now was face the truth. And so, in my final moments, I did something I had never done before. I humbled myself. I let go of the bitterness. And I turned to Jesus. I couldn't stop looking at him. Bloodied, beaten, suffering just like me, but not like me at all. He had no sin. No guilt. Nothing to deserve this death. And yet, here he was. Hanging beside criminals. Dying like the worst of us. The pain in my body was unbearable, but something deeper ached inside me. A lifetime of regret. I had spent my years taking from others, hurting people, doing whatever it took to survive. I had lied, stolen, betrayed. I had lived without care, without conscience. I had never prayed. Never repented. Never done a single thing to deserve forgiveness. But now, at the very end, when all hope was gone, when my fate was sealed, there was this man. Jesus. I didn't understand everything about him. I had heard the rumors. Some called him a teacher. Others called him a prophet. Some even called him the Messiah. But looking at him now, I knew. He was a king. Not like the rulers of this world, draped in robes, surrounded by soldiers. No, he had no wealth, no army. But he had something greater. And in that moment, I believed. I didn't even know what I was asking for. I just knew I had to say something. So I turned to him, gasping through the pain, my voice barely more than a whisper. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I didn't ask him to save me from this cross. I didn't ask him to take away my suffering. I didn't even ask him to forgive me. I just wanted to be remembered. Because deep down, I knew the truth. I had nothing to offer. Nothing to give. I had no good deeds to my name. No second chances left. I deserved to be forgotten. And so, as the weight of my sins pressed down on me, I waited. Waited for silence. Waited for rejection. Waited for what I knew I deserved. But then, Jesus moved. His head, heavy with suffering, lifted. His eyes, full of pain, full of agony, turned toward me. And he spoke. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. I stopped breathing. I stared at him, my body numb, my mind unable to grasp what I had just heard. Today? With him? In paradise? Not forgotten. Not abandoned. Saved. In an instant, my fate had changed. A lifetime of sin, wiped away. Not because I earned it. Not because I deserved it. But because he said so. Because he had the power to say so. For the first time in my life, I felt peace. For the first time in my life, I knew. I was going home. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. Even through the agony, even as my body screamed in pain, I felt something I hadn't known in years. Hope. Jesus had promised me paradise. Not judgment. Not punishment. Not rejection. Paradise. I wanted to cry, to fall to my knees, to worship him. But I couldn't move. My body was still nailed to this cross, my breath still shallow, my time still running out. And yet, something inside me was already changing. I was still dying. But I was no longer afraid. I turned my head toward Jesus again. His breathing was ragged, his body trembling under the weight of his suffering. The blood from his wounds dripped onto the wood beneath him, his face pale and drawn. But he never cursed. Never fought back. Never begged for relief. The crowd that had mocked him earlier had grown quieter now. The jeering wasn't as loud. The laughter had faded. They were starting to realize. This was no ordinary man. And then, he spoke one last time. His voice was hoarse, but strong. It is finished. A chill ran through my broken body. Finished? The sky, once bright and burning, began to darken. A strange, unnatural shadow stretched over the city. The wind picked up, howling through the hilltop like a warning. And then, the ground moved. A deep, violent tremor shook the earth beneath us. The crosses rattled. The soldiers stumbled, their faces twisting in fear. The crowd shrieked, backing away as dust and rock crumbled from the hillside. Even in my pain, I felt it. The whole world was responding to what had just happened. This was not the death of an ordinary man. The centurion, one of the Roman soldiers, a man who had seen countless executions, stared up at Jesus' lifeless body, his mouth slightly open. And then, as if something had finally clicked inside him, he whispered the words no Roman should ever say. Surely, this man was the Son of God. I closed my eyes. It was over. Jesus was gone. But I knew. I knew. This was not the end. Because he had promised me. And Jesus did not lie. Even as the darkness grew deeper, even as my own life faded, I knew one thing for certain. The next time I opened my eyes, I would see him again. And I would finally be home. I could feel it now. My body was failing. The pain that had once burned like fire had dulled into something distant, something beyond my reach. My arms trembled, my legs hung useless beneath me. My breaths were shallow, coming in short gasps, each one harder to take than the last. I didn't have much time left. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. Jesus' words echoed in my mind. Today, you will be with me in paradise. I closed my eyes and let the words sink in. I should have been forgotten. I had nothing to give, no good deeds to my name, no reason to be remembered. And yet, he had spoken to me. Not to the priests in their robes. Not to the Roman rulers. Not to the crowds who had come to watch him die. To me. A thief. A sinner. A condemned man. I could still hear the sounds of the world around me. The murmuring of the crowd as they shuffled away, the whispers of soldiers still shaken from what they had just witnessed. I could hear sobbing, women crying somewhere nearby. And I could hear the wind. That strange wind that had come when Jesus took his last breath, stirring the dust at my feet, cooling my fevered skin. But none of it mattered now. Because I knew where I was going. I opened my eyes one last time and looked up at the sky. The darkness was still there, covering the land like a heavy shroud. But beyond it, far above, past the clouds, past the weight of this world. Paradise. It was waiting for me. The thought made me smile. A small, weak smile. If only my younger self could see me now. The man who had spent his whole life running, fighting, stealing, now surrendering, now resting. I let out a slow breath, my body sinking against the weight of the cross. Everything was fading now. The noise. The pain. The fear. And then, nothing. Darkness. Stillness. But not emptiness. Because for the first time in my life, I was at peace. I was a thief. A sinner. A man condemned. My whole life, I had taken and never given. I had lied, cheated, and destroyed. I had nothing to offer, nothing to redeem me. I had burned every bridge, wasted every chance. And I knew that I deserved that cross. But in my final moments, I met the King. And he saved me. Not because I had earned it. Not because I was worthy. But because he is merciful. Because he saw me when no one else did. Because he remembered me. In a world that had cast me aside, he called me his own. I had spent my whole life believing I was beyond saving. But in a single breath, he wiped away every sin, every failure, every regret. Because that's who he is. He is not just a teacher. Not just a prophet. Not just a man. He is the Son of God. The Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. The Savior who speaks life to the dying. The King who welcomes even the lowest, the worst, the most broken. I should have been forgotten. But he remembered me. I should have been cast away. But he welcomed me. I should have died in darkness. But he brought me into the light. And if he could save me, a thief, a sinner, a man condemned, then he can save anyone. Because mercy isn't just for the righteous. It's for the lost. It's for the broken. It's for those who think they've gone too far, done too much, fallen too deep. It's for those who feel unworthy, unseen, unforgivable. It's for the ones the world has discarded, the ones who feel like hope is gone. It's for me. And it's for you.